All right, we are ready for our final video on the book of Deuteronomy. This is a review. There will be no more of these videos that are designed to catch us up. We may do videos in the future for some other purpose, but the purpose of keeping us caught up on our Bible classes, this will be the last of those. As we had to stop our classes on Wednesday and Sunday morning due to the coronavirus, this was all an effort to keep us caught up so that when we resume our classes, we will not have missed that material. So we finished John. We actually finished Deuteronomy in our last video on the book of Deuteronomy. And this one is slated to be a review. So let's see where we are and where we're going as we look at the book of Deuteronomy in review. The itinerary that we have been following for this trimester, January through April, slates this Wednesday night as a study of a review of the book of Deuteronomy. And so that's what this is going to be. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to just have time just to basically run through the high points of the outlines. We won't even mention every point in the outline of each chapter. But our effort is to go back and look at some introductory material, kind of quickly run through each one of the sermons. Here was the main point of that sermon. Here is how it divides out. Here were the points that were being made. We're not even going to be reading much of the text. So this is just a quick review, much quicker than it would have been had we been in class in the building. But this is an effort to review the book of Deuteronomy. You remember that the book of Deuteronomy is a farewell address of Moses. It's a book that looks both backward and forward. The first 11 chapters seems to be retrospective, where chapters 12 to 34 is prospective. And we see that more as we go through each of the chapters. This is a transition book. It's a transition from the wilderness wanderings to the new land, to the promised land. They're going to have a new leader and a new possession. The name Deuteronomy comes from the Septuagint translation. It's found in chapter 17 in verse 18, the word for copy. This literally means the second law. It's a compound word meaning the second law. Well, this is actually not the second law like another law being given, but it's the re-emphasis of the law, or the law being emphasized again. The author is Moses. Chapter 1 and verse 1, 4 and 44, and 21 and 29 and 1, and 39 and 1 all suggest that Moses is the author. He would have written all but the closing chapter, and that would be obvious because it was about his death, chapter 34. We don't know who wrote that chapter. Perhaps Joshua did. Some have suggested. Now let's talk about the setting of the book. The setting of the book is on the eastern side of Jordan in the plains of Moab, according to chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. We'll come back to that slide we just left, but it's showing you where they are. This is the Dead Sea, and this is the region that they're in the plains of Moab, across from Jericho. This is where they are as they're making their way, getting ready to cross over the Jordan, and they'll take Jericho and then Ai. So the setting is on the eastern side of Jordan. This is in the 40th year of the wilderness wanderings, chapter 1 and verse 3 suggests. So this is near the end of the life of Moses. In fact, it's the last month in the life of Moses is the setting for this book. What about the date of the book? Well, the date and the writing of the book, or that is the date of the events, the sermons being delivered, and the writing of it would be approximately at the same time because this would be the last month in the life of Moses. And so the time period is somewhere around 1420 to 1400 BC. We'll not go back over how we determined that date. Some have suggested it's much later, like 1260. But the book is covering about 2 months, including 30 days for mourning. Deuteronomy 1 in verse 3 and Joshua 4 in verse 19, that 30 days of mourning for the life of Moses. I like what William Smith called this. He called it a 30-day revival. In other words, here's a 30-day period in which Moses is delivering the message that's found within the pages of the book of Deuteronomy. It's a message about obedience to the law, and has 3 or 4 sermons, I think 4 perhaps, as he delivers that message. And we'll talk about the contents of that now. The book consists mainly of addresses by Moses. There are different views. Some say there are 3 sermons, and others say 4. And that's not so much a contradiction as how do you count chapters 31 to 34. Some think that there are three sermons, and I suppose this down here is the more popular view of the three sermons. You got chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 26, and 27 to 30. And that 31 to 34 is not really a sermon, but an addendum to the book. And so that's the reason for the three sermon view. Others have suggested that 1 to 4 and 5 to 30 and 31 to 34 are the three sermons, combining the two that would be separated here. I think perhaps this is the better view of the book as I have studied it again, thinking that maybe this view of the four sermon is correct. That's not a big deal, whether it's 3 or 4. It's much like we illustrated in our class, a preacher who preaches 3 sermons on Sunday, maybe after the last sermon he gets up and exhorts over some matter for another 15 minutes. And some go away saying we had 3 sermons, and others go away saying we had 4. They're not contradictory. How do you view that last exhortation? Was it a sermon, or was it just kind of an addendum to what's already been said? So here are the 4 sermons we're going to look at. And we're going to take each one of those and emphasize them. So basically, again, we have 34 chapters. We really don't have time to even spend a minute on each chapter within this short summary or review. So let's look at the first sermon here. Here, the first sermon is in chapters 1 to 4, the second in 5 to 26, the third in 27 to 30, and the fourth is in 31 to 34. The biggest and the longest is going to be 5 to 26. So let's look further at, we'll come back to those in a moment, but let's continue talking about the contents. The words were spoken to all of Israel. He looks to the past, he looks to the future, and he reemphasizes the law. Now, let's talk about why the law needed to be reemphasized. Why is there a need on the verge of going into the land of Canaan, the need to emphasize the law again, the second giving of the law? Well, 4 reasons we suggest. There's a new generation. As we've often said, we teach first grade every year in school, so a new generation needs to be taught what the previous generation may have or should have learned. Secondly, there are different conditions. They're exchanging the wandering in the wilderness for stability and prosperity, and that causes some problems for them. Thirdly, they're going to be exposed to idolatrous influences. And fourthly, there's a new leader. Moses is departing, and Joshua is to lead. Now, here's the outline we have followed throughout the book from Warren Wiersbe. He puts it in historical concerns, practical concerns, prophetical concerns, and personal concerns. And so in chapters 1 through 4 are the historical concerns, and that's where we begin in looking at chapter 4, 1 to 4 in just a moment. Now let's compare this book to other books. Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are somewhat technical, not in every aspect, but there are technical things within the book of some instructions belonging to the priest and to the Levites, such as particularly in Leviticus of how the sacrifices were to be offered and when they were to be offered and the details thereof. Where Deuteronomy seems to be directed to everyone. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. Again, comparison. This is from J. Sidlow Baxter. He is good in comparing one book to another book and how they relate. And so here in the Pentateuch, we have Genesis. It deals with the ruin of through man's sins. Exodus, the redemption by blood. Leviticus, communion on the grounds of atonement. Numbers, having to do with direction by the will of God. And Deuteronomy, destination through faithfulness. That is the destination to the land of Canaan. Again, Baxter gives this comparison. Genesis deals with divine sovereignty. Exodus, divine power. Leviticus, divine holiness. Numbers, divine goodness and severity. And Deuteronomy, divine faithfulness. God brought them to the land. He'll take them into the land, and he emphasizes his faithfulness to them. Dehoff, on the other hand, makes this comparison to other books. Genesis, the beginning of a chosen nation. Exodus, organization of that nation and the law. Leviticus, the way the people are to worship. Numbers, the wilderness wanderings. And then Deuteronomy, the final preparation before entering the promised land. This book is quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted 83 times in the New Testament. 21 books make reference to the book of Deuteronomy. When Jesus was tempted in Matthew 4, all 3 times he quoted from the Old Testament was from Deuteronomy, chapter 8 and chapter 6. One of the things we've talked about throughout the book is the fear of God. No book says more about fear than this book. And our challenge was throughout the study to mark every reference in the margin of your text, mark something about the fear of God every time you see the fear as it is directed toward God, and ask the question, what does this text teach us about fear. It may be defining fear. It may be telling you what fear does. It may be giving you an example of someone who fears or who doesn't fear. And so this is an excellent study. If you didn't keep up with that, I would encourage you to go back and do a search for the word fear as it is found in the book of Deuteronomy. All right, we're 10 minutes in, but let's see what we can do for the next few minutes of giving a summary. So here's the first sermon. The first sermon, chapters 1 to 4, deals with obedience based upon the past. It's a short sermon, but let's get the gist of it. In chapter 1, it's a review of from Sinai, from leaving Sinai up to Kadesh. The emphasis seems to be on Israel's unbelief and their rebellion. So he brings them through their history about how they rebelled, and they're not allowed to enter because of their rebellion, and so they had to be in the wilderness for 40 years. Chapter 2 deals with the wilderness wanderings continuing on and the victory over Sihon. And then chapter 3 deals with their victory over Og. These were two major kings on the east side of Jordan. Talks about the division of the land and reminded them Moses couldn't enter the land because he disobeyed. So chapter 4 now comes to the heart of what the sermon is about, based upon their history of rebellion and the history of God's blessing them and the history of God's goodness. They need to be obedient to the law. It talks about the cities of refuge, but that's the point of the book of Deuteronomy as well as the first sermon, obedience to the law. Now this is the longest sermon, the second, 5 to 26. It's the repeating of the law. And it deals with three things, as Wiersbe outlines it: the testimonies, the statutes, and then the judgment. So let's get 5 through 11, the testimonies. He starts with the giving of the Ten Commandments. They've already been given, but he reemphasizes them, and the text talks about the people fearing God. Deuteronomy 6 was a favored section of the Jews called the Shema, based upon the word hear. This deals with the place, the warning, and the meaning of the law. They're to obey the law and teach it diligently to their children. He warns them, when you get into the land, you're going to have it better than you ever had it, and you'll forget about God in the midst of your prosperity. He talks about the meaning and the purpose of the law. When your children ask, what are these statutes all about? Here's what you tell them. So here's the reemphasis of the law. Deuteronomy 7 talks about a separate people, how that they're to utterly destroy the nations, how they're to dispossess the people. You're a special and blessed people, so you're to live separate from the people. Chapter 8 goes back to what chapter 4 had talked about, keeping the commandments. Obey every command. Don't forget God in your prosperity, just like he had said in chapter 6 and in verse 12. Now, chapter 9 deals with a warning against pride and self-righteousness. When you enter into the land, it's not because of your own power and your own righteousness. Remember, you're a stiff-necked people, and you were spared because of Moses' plea and because of the mercy of God. Now, chapter 10 deals with mercy and obedience. Here's that theme again of obedience. There's evidence of God's forgiveness and acceptance, but obedience is to be from the heart, 12 to 22. Now, that first section ends with chapter 11, and it deals with love and obedience. Here's the instruction of chapter 11 and in verse 1. And then the reasons for that instruction. The instruction was, therefore you shall love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments always. The reasons for that are given, and then there's a blessing and a curse. Now those blessings and curses will come to play later in the book. Now, let's move to what Wiersbe calls the statutes, as he outlines it, starting in chapter 12. Just a second point in this longer sermon. So here he talks about worship as God directs, beginning in chapter 12. This is a key chapter because it talks about the place that God would choose for worship. It would become Shiloh and then later Jerusalem, but the place where God establishes where they are to worship. That's referred to time and again from this point on. Chapter 13, there is to be destruction of those that lead to idolatry. There's false prophets, one who would secretly entice, destroy those. Even if it involves family, they are to be destroyed. He warns them about unclean, mourning like the heathen. Don't adopt the heathen practices. Tells them about clean and unclean animals and about tithing. There is the 7th year release, how debt would be canceled. There was regulations about lending to the poor, the release of servants, and the law of the firstborn flocks. There are 4 annual feasts that are mentioned, 3 annual feasts mentioned here, and then he talks about just judges, the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and Feast of the Tabernacles. Chapter 17 deals with sacrifice. They were to sacrifice the best to the Lord. They were to kill an idolater, how how to decide hard legal cases, and then he talks about a king's behavior. Now, Deuteronomy 18 ought to stand out because we're going to see that time and again as even we get to the New Testament, not only about the Levite portion, the heathen practices they were to avoid, but there is the promise that God would raise up a prophet like unto Moses, which is a prophecy concerning the Messiah. Now, the third and final section of this second and longest sermon deals with the judgments. And so in beginning at chapter 19, he deals with the cities of refuge, respecting landmarks, has to do with witnesses. And so here are various regulations, rules about warfare, chapter 20, chapter 21, and then on through chapter 24, even through the end of the rest of the sermon, deals with a lot of miscellaneous laws. We won't go through every one, but how do you deal with unsolved murder, about taking a woman captive, the rights of the firstborn in a polygamous marriage. Chapter 22 continues that. Don't mix diverse things like in 9 through 11, the tassels on the garments, various sexual laws. Back in verses 1 to 4, responsibility toward neighbors. Chapter 23, the purity of the congregation in the camp. Those that couldn't come into the camp, cleanliness and purity of the camp. The runaway slave, harlots, sodomites were to be excluded. Obligations and our respect toward other people. Now, Deuteronomy 24 dealt with divorce laws. Divorce, the contingency law of verses 1 to 4. The miscellaneous laws found in 5 to 22. 25, again, deals with miscellaneous laws, primarily fairness of not muzzling the ox, punishment of the wicked, the abuse of a woman during fighting, integrity in business. These are miscellaneous laws primarily focusing on fairness. Chapter 26 ended that sermon dealing with the ceremonial obligations, offering of the first fruits, offering of the third year tithe, and then there's finally some closing remarks. Now that's 2 of the 4 sermons. Here we're ready for the third. It's a shorter sermon. So we only have chapters 27 to 30. It deals with the renewal of the covenant. So here's the covenant renewal. Now you'll remember, because this is closer to our end of our study, that this ought to be more familiar with us than the first part of like chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 26. We see here in chapter 27, there was a command to erect stones at Mount Ebal, and then again, emphasis on obedience. Every sermon emphasizes that. Then there's the proclamation of the curses, divide the tribes between the 2 mountains, and the Levites were to speak and the people say amen. Well, chapter 28 dealt with the blessings if you obey and curses if you disobey. This ought to remind them on the verge of going into the land, if we obey God, we're blessed. If we disobey, we're going to be cursed. And so chapter 29, the obedience should be based upon God's grace, a call for them to enter into the covenant. There was a warning about departing from the covenant. So here is the renewal of the covenant. Now, there's going to be a time, God will recognize, that they would disobey the covenant. So they would be blessed if they return to God. God's will is not hard. It's not difficult. They have a choice, and they can come back to God. Now, that ends the third sermon. Now we're ready for the fourth and the final. This may be an addendum, not really a sermon, but we're viewing it as a sermon. So verses 31 to 34, it all comes out the same. It's a message that was delivered. Here is a warning. So this is Moses' farewell. He told him not to be afraid. God's going to be with you. The law is to be read every 7 years. There's going to be a new leader, a warning and a song, and the new leader obviously is Joshua. Now here's the song of Moses that we just recently studied in chapter 32. It was somewhat prophetic about what's going to happen to them, but here is the song that should serve as a warning and as a witness against them. And so we see that there's the exhortation to carefully obey the law. Now that's the same thing we've been seeing in every sermon, careful obedience to the law. Then Moses is said to die, or is supposed to die on Mount Nebo. Now he doesn't die in this chapter, but God tells him he's going to die on Mount Nebo. Now there's a blessing that's given for Israel. God's glory is seen in giving the law. There's a blessing for each tribe, and happiness comes to those who, to a blessed people because of their obedience to the law. And so he ends on that note of obedience and blessing if they would but obey. Now, chapter 34, the end of the book, deals with the death of Moses. Joshua is a new leader, and then a tribute is given to Moses. Now, Moses wrote the book except for the last chapter. This obviously could not have been written by him. Who wrote it? Perhaps Joshua, though we do not know. So here is the 4 sermons. And so we're going to leave on this note of the 4 sermons of the book of Deuteronomy. The first one deals with obedience based upon the past. The second, repeating the law, telling them to be obedient to the law. The third sermon, the renewal of the covenant, the blessings and the curses. And then here's the warning, a song, and a blessing that is to be given. I hope these have been helpful in keeping us caught up on our studies of the book of Deuteronomy. We are going to have studies beginning soon at the building on Wednesday nights and hopefully soon thereafter on Sunday morning. And so we shouldn't be behind. We will start Joshua and the book of Acts in September is the plan.